Tonight on Rising Together, we dive into 8 terrifying ghost stories you won't forget. From haunting windows to shadowy graveyards to chilling encounters and dark family secrets, these tales will linger long after you stop listening. Stay tuned, these stories will haunt you.
The Grave by Guy de Maupassant. The 17th of July, 1883. At 2:30 in the morning, the watchman in the cemetery of Bessières, who lived in a small cottage on the edge of his field of the dead, was awakened by the barking of his dog, which was shut up in the kitchen. Going down quickly, he saw the animal sniffing at the crack of the door and barking furiously, as if some tramp had been sneaking about the house. The keeper, Vincent, therefore took his gun and went out. His dog, preceding him, at once ran in the direction of the avenue General Bonnet, stopping short at the monument of Madame Tomoiseau. The keeper, advancing cautiously, soon saw a faint light on the side of the avenue Malenvert, and stealing in among the graves, he came upon a horrible act of profanation. A man had dug up the coffin of a young woman who had been buried the evening before, and was dragging the corpse out of it. A small dark lantern, standing on a pile of earth, lighted up this hideous scene. Vincent sprang upon the wretch, threw him to the ground, bound his hands, and took him to the police station. It was a young, wealthy, and respected lawyer in town named Courbataille. He was brought into court. The public prosecutor opened the case by referring to the monstrous deeds of the Sergeant Bertrand. A wave of indignation swept over the courtroom. When the magistrate sat down, the crowd assembled cried, "Death! Death!" With difficulty the presiding judge established silence. Then he said gravely, "Defendant, what have you to say in your defence?" Courbataille, who had refused counsel, rose. He was a handsome fellow, tall, brown, with a frank face, energetic manner, and a fearless eye. Paying no attention to the whistlings in the room, he began to speak in a voice that was low and veiled at first, but that grew more firm as he proceeded. "Monsieur le Président, gentlemen of the jury, I have very little to say. The woman whose grave I violated was my sweetheart. I loved her. I loved her not with a sensual love, and not with a mere tenderness of heart and soul, but with an absolute, complete love, with an overpowering passion. Hear me. When I met her for the first time, I felt a strange sensation. It was not astonishment nor admiration, nor yet that which is called love at first sight, but a feeling of delicious well-being, as if I had been plunged into a warm bath. Her gestures seduced me, her voice enchanted me, and it was with infinite pleasure that I looked upon her person. It seemed to me as if I had seen her before, and as if I had known her a long time. She had within her something of my spirit. She seemed to me like an answer to a cry uttered by my soul, to that vague and unceasing cry with which we call upon hope during our whole life. When I knew her a little better, the mere thought of seeing her again filled me with exquisite and profound uneasiness. The touch of her hand in mine was more delightful to me than anything that I had imagined. Her smile filled me with a mad joy, with a desire to run, to dance, to fling myself upon the ground. So we became lovers. Yes, more than that, she was my very life. I looked for nothing further on earth and had no further desires. I longed for nothing further. One evening, when we had gone on a somewhat long walk by the river, we were overtaken by the rain, and she caught cold. It developed into pneumonia the next day, and a week later she was dead. During the hours of her suffering, astonishment and consternation prevented my understanding and reflecting upon it. But when she was dead, I was so overwhelmed by blank despair that I had no thoughts left. I wept. During all the horrible details of the interment, my keen and wild grief was like a madness, a kind of sensual, physical grief. Then, when she was gone, when she was under the earth, my mind at once found itself again, and I passed through a series of moral suffering so terrible that even the love that she had vouchsafed to me was dear at that price. Then the fixed idea came to me. I shall not see her again. When one dwells on this thought for a whole day, one feels as if he were going mad. Just think of it. There is a woman whom you adore, a unique woman, for in the whole universe there is not a second one like her. This woman has given herself to you and has created with you the mysterious union that is called love. Her eye seems to you more vast than space, more charming than the world, that clear eye smiling with her tenderness. This woman loves you. When she speaks to you, her voice floods you with joy. And suddenly she disappears. Think of it. She disappears, not only for you, but forever. She is dead. Do you understand what that means? Never, 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 not anywhere will she exist any more. Never more will that eye look upon anything again. Never more will that voice, nor any voice like it, utter a word in the same way as she uttered it. Never more will a face be born that is like hers. Never, never. The molds of statues are kept, casts are kept by which one can make objects with the same outlines and forms. But that one body and that one face will never more be born again upon the earth. And yet millions and millions of creatures will be born, and more than that. And this one woman will not reappear among all the women of the future. Is it possible? It drives one mad to think of it. She lived for 20 years, not more. And she has disappeared forever, forever, forever. She thought, she smiled, she loved me. And now, nothing. The flies that die in the autumn are as much as we are in this world. And now, nothing. And I thought that her body, her fresh body, so warm, so sweet, so white, so lovely, would rot down there in that box under the earth. And her soul, her thought, her love, where is it? Not to see her again. The idea of this decomposing body that I might yet recognize haunted me. I wanted to look at it once more. I went out with a spade, a lantern, and a hammer. I jumped over the cemetery wall and I found the grave, which had not yet been closed entirely. I uncovered the coffin and took up a board. An abominable odor, the stench of putrefaction greeted my nostrils. Oh, her bed perfumed with orris. Yet I opened the coffin, and holding my lighted lantern down into it, I saw her. Her face was blue, swollen, frightful. Black liquid had oozed out of her mouth. She! That was she! Horror seized me. But I stretched out my arm to draw this monstrous face toward me. And then I was caught. All night I have retained the foul odor of this putrid body, the odor of my well-beloved, as one retains the perfume of a woman after a love embrace. Do with me what you will.
A strange silence seemed to oppress the room. They seemed to be waiting for something more. The jury retired to deliberate. When they came back a few minutes later, the accused showed no fear, and did not even seem to think. The president announced, with the usual formalities, that his judges declared him to be not guilty. He did not move, and the room applauded. End of The Grave by Guy de Maupassant.
Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama.
The Open Window by H. Monroe, or pen name Saki. The Open Window. "My aunt will be down presently, Mr. Nuttall," said a very self-possessed young lady of 15. "In the meantime you must try and put up with me." Frampton Nuttall endeavoured to say the correct something which should duly hatter the niece of the moment without unduly discounting the aunt that was to come. Privately, he doubted more than ever whether these formal visits on a succession of total strangers would do much towards helping the nerve cure which he was supposed to be undergoing. "I know how it will be," his sister had said when he was preparing to migrate to this rural retreat. "You will bury yourself down there and not speak to a living soul, and your nerves will be worse than ever from moping. I shall just give you letters of introduction to all the people I know there. Some of them, as far as I can remember, were quite nice." Frampton wondered whether Mrs. Sappleton, the lady to whom he was presenting one of the letters of introduction, came into the nice division. "Do you know many of the people around here?" asked the niece, when she judged that they had had sufficient silent communion. "Hardly a soul," said Frampton. "My sister was staying here at the rectory, you know, some 4 years ago, and she gave me letters of introduction to some of the people here." He made the last statement in a tone of distinct regret. "Then you know practically nothing about my aunt," pursued the self-possessed young lady. "Only her name and address," admitted the caller. He was wondering whether Mrs. Sappleton was in the married or widowed state. An undefinable something about the room seemed to suggest masculine habitation. "Her great tragedy happened just 3 years ago," said the child. "That would be since your sister's time." "Her tragedy?" asked Frampton. Somehow in this restful country spot tragedies seemed out of place. "You may wonder why we keep that window wide open on an October afternoon," said the niece, indicating a large French window that opened onto a lawn. "It is quite warm for the time of the year," said Frampton. "But has that window got anything to do with the tragedy?" "Out through that window, 3 years ago today, her husband and her 2 young brothers went off for their day's shooting. They never came back. In crossing the moor to their favorite snipe shooting ground, they were all 3 engulfed in a treacherous piece of bog. It had been that dreadful wet summer, you know, and places that were safe in other years gave way suddenly without warning. Their bodies were never recovered. That was the dreadful part of it." Here the child's voice lost its self-possessed note and became falteringly human. "Poor aunt always thinks that they'll come back some day. They and the little brown spaniel that was lost with them, and walk in at that window just as they used to do. That is why the window is kept open every evening till it is quite dusk. Poor dear aunt, she has often told me how they went out, her husband with his white waterproof coat over his arms, and Ronnie, her youngest brother, singing 'Bertie, why do you bound?' as he always did to tease her, because she said it got on her nerves. Do you know, sometimes on still, quiet evenings like this, I almost get a creepy feeling that they will all walk in through that window." She broke off with a little shudder. It was a relief to Frampton when the aunt bustled into the room with a whirl of apologies for being late in making her appearance. "I hope Vera has been amusing you," she said. "She has been very interesting," said Frampton. "I hope you don't mind the open window," said Mrs. Sappleton briskly. "My husband and brothers will be home directly from shooting, and they always come in this way. They've been out for snipe in the marshes today, so they'll make a fine mess over my poor carpets. So like you men folk, isn't it?" She rattled on cheerfully about the shooting, and the scarcity of birds, and the prospects for duck in the winter. To Frampton it was all purely horrible. He made a desperate but only partially successful effort to turn the talk on to a less ghastly topic. He was conscious that his hostess was giving him only a fragment of her attention, and her eyes were constantly straying past him to the open window and the lawn beyond. It was certainly an unfortunate coincidence that he should have paid his visit on this tragic anniversary. The doctors agree in ordering me complete rest, an absence of mental excitement, and avoidance of anything in the nature of violent physical exercise, announced Frampton, who labored under the tolerably widespread delusion that total strangers and chance acquaintances are hungry for the least detail of one's ailments and infirmities, their cause and cure. On the matter of diet they are not so much in agreement, he continued. No, said Mrs. Sappleton in a voice which only replaced a yawn at the last moment. Then she suddenly brightened into alert attention, but not to what Frampton was saying. Here they are at last, she cried. Just in time for tea, and don't they look as if they were muddy up to the eyes? Frampton shivered slightly and turned towards the niece with a look intended to convey sympathetic comprehension. The child was staring out through the open window with a dazed horror in her eyes. In a chill shock of nameless fear, Frampton swung round in his seat, looked in the same direction. In the deepening twilight, 3 figures were walking across the lawn towards the window. They all carried guns under their arms, and one of them was additionally burdened with a white coat hung over his shoulders. A tired brown spaniel kept close at their heels. Noiselessly they neared the house, and then a hoarse young voice chanted out of the dusk, I said, Bertie, why don't you bound? Frampton grabbed wildly at his stick and hat. The hall door, the gravel drive, and the front gate were dimly noted stages in his headlong retreat. A cyclist coming along the road had to run into the hedge to avoid imminent collision. Here we are, my dear, said the bearer of the white mackintosh, coming in through the window. Fairly muddy, but most of it's dry. Who was that who bolted out as we came up? A most extraordinary man, Mr. Nuttall, said Mrs. Sappleton. Could only talk about his illness and dashed off without a word of goodbye or apology when you arrived. One would think he had seen a ghost. I expect it was the spaniel, said the niece calmly. He told me he had a horror of dogs. He was once hunted into a cemetery somewhere on the banks of the Ganges by a pack of pariah dogs, and had to spend the night in a newly dug grave with the creatures snarling and grinning and foaming just above him. Enough to make anyone lose their nerve. Romance at short notice was her specialty. End of The Open Window. Recording by April Lowe.
Drake's Drum by William Hunt. Sir Francis Drake, who appears to have been especially befriended by his demon, is said to drive at night a black hearse drawn by headless horses and urged on by running devils and yelping headless dogs through Jump on the road from Tavistock to Plymouth. Sir Francis, according to tradition, was enabled to destroy the Spanish Armada by the aid of the devil. The old admiral went to Devil's Point, a well-known promontory jutting into Plymouth Sound. He there cut pieces of wood into the water, and by the power of magic and the assistance of his demon, these became at once well-armed gunboats. Queen Elizabeth gave Sir Francis Drake Buckland Abbey, and on every hand we hear of Drake and his familiars. An extensive building attached to the abbey, which was no doubt used as barns and stables after the place had been deprived of its religious character, was said to have been built by the devil in 3 nights. After the first night, the butler, astonished at the work done, resolved to watch and see how it was performed. Consequently, on the second night, he mounted into a large tree, and hid himself behind the forks of its 5 branches. At midnight, the devil came, driving several teams of oxen, and as some of them were lazy, he plucked this tree from the ground and used it as a goad. The poor butler lost his senses and never recovered them. Drake constructed the channel carrying the waters from Dartmoor to Plymouth, Tradition says he went with his demon to Dartmoor, walked into Plymouth, and the waters followed him. Even now, as old Betty Donnythorne, formerly the housekeeper at Buckland Abbey, told me, if the warrior hears a drum which hangs in the hall of the abbey, and which accompanied him round the world, he rises and has a revel. Some few years since a small box was found in a closet which had been long closed, containing, it is supposed, family papers. This was to be sent to the residence of the inheritor of this property. The carriage was at the abbey door, and a man easily lifted the box into it. The owner having taken his seat, the coachman attempted to start his horses, but in vain. They would not, they could not move. More horses were brought, and then the heavy farm horses, and eventually all the oxen. They were powerless to start the carriage. At length a mysterious voice was heard, declaring the box could never be moved from Buckland Abbey. It was taken from the carriage easily by one man, and a pair of horses galloped off with the carriage. End of Drake's Drum. Recording by Ratandi Satwant Singh, Jamshedpur, India.
Sredni Vashtar by Saki. Conradin was 10 years old, and the doctor had pronounced his professional opinion that the boy would not live another 5 years. The doctor was silky and effete, and counted for little, but his opinion was endorsed by Mrs. de Ropp, who counted for nearly everything. Mrs. de Ropp was Conradin's cousin and guardian, and in his eyes she represented those 3/5 of the world that are necessary and disagreeable and real. The other 2/5, in perpetual antagonism to the foregoing, were summed up in himself and his imagination. One of these days, Conradin supposed, he would succumb to the mastering pressure of wearisome necessary things, such as illnesses and coddling restrictions and drawn-out dullness. Without his imagination, which was rampant under the spur of loneliness, he would have succumbed long ago. Mrs. de Ropp would never, in her honestest moments, have confessed to herself that she disliked Conradin, though she might have been dimly aware that thwarting him for his good was a duty which she did not find particularly irksome. Conradin hated her with a desperate sincerity which he was perfectly able to mask. Such few pleasures as he could contrive for himself gained an additional relish from the likelihood that they would be displeasing to his guardian, and from the realm of his imagination she was locked out, an unclean thing which should find no entrance. In the dull, cheerless garden, overlooked by so many windows that were ready to open with a message not to do this or that, or a reminder that medicines were due, he found little attraction. The few fruit trees that it contained were set jealously apart from his plucking, as though they were rare specimens of their kind, blooming in an arid waste. It would probably have been difficult to find a market gardener who would have offered 10 shillings for their entire yearly produce. In a forgotten corner, however, almost hidden behind a dismal shrubbery, was a disused tool-shed, of respectable proportions, and within its walls Conradin found a haven, something that took on the varying aspects of a playroom and a cathedral. He had peopled it with a legion of familiar phantoms, evoked partly from fragments of history and partly from his own brain, but it also boasted 2 inmates of flesh and blood. In one corner lived a ragged, plumaged Houdan hen, on which the boy lavished an affection that had scarcely another outlet. Further back in the gloom stood a large hutch, divided into 2 compartments, one of which was fronted with close iron bars. This was the abode of a large polecat ferret, which a friendly butcher boy had once smuggled, cage and all, into its present quarters, in exchange for a long secreted hoard of small silver. Conradin was dreadfully afraid of the lithe, sharp-fanged beast, but it was his most treasured possession. Its very presence in the tool-shed was a secret and fearful joy, to be kept scrupulously from the knowledge of the woman, as he privately dubbed his cousin. And one day, out of heaven knows what material, he spun the beast a wonderful name, and from that moment it grew into a god and a religion. The woman indulged in religion once a week at a church nearby, and took Conradin with her. But to him the church service was an alien rite in the house of Rimmon. Every Thursday, in the dim and musty silence of the tool shed, he worshipped with mystic and elaborate ceremonial before the wooden hutch where dwelt Sredni Vashtar, the great ferret. Red flowers in their season and scarlet berries in the winter-time were offered at his shrine, for he was a god who laid some special stress on the fierce, impatient side of things, as opposed to the woman's religion, which, as far as Conradin could observe, went to great lengths in the contrary direction. And on great festivals, powdered nutmeg was strewn in front of his hutch, an important feature of the offering being that the nutmeg had to be stolen. These festivals were of irregular occurrence and were chiefly appointed to celebrate some passing event. On one occasion, when Mrs. de Ropp suffered from acute toothache for 3 days, Conradin kept up the festival during the entire 3 days, and almost succeeded in persuading himself that Sredni Vashtar was personally responsible for the toothache. If the malady had lasted for another day, the supply of nutmeg would have given out. The Houdan hen was never drawn into the cult of Sredni Vashtar. Conradin had long ago settled that she was an Anabaptist. He did not pretend to have the remotest knowledge as to what an Anabaptist was, but he privately hoped that it was dashing and not very respectable. Mrs. de Ropp was the ground plan on which he based and detested all respectability. After a while, Conradin's absorption in the tool-shed began to attract the notice of his guardian. "It is not good for him to be pottering down there in all weathers," she promptly decided, and at breakfast one morning she announced that the Houdan hen had been sold and taken away overnight. With her short-sighted eyes she peered at Conradin, waiting for an outbreak of rage and sorrow, which she was ready to rebuke with a flow of excellent precepts and reasoning. But Conradin said nothing. There was nothing to be said. Something, perhaps, in his white, set face gave her a momentary qualm, for at tea that afternoon there was toast on the table, a delicacy which she usually banned, on the ground that it was bad for him, also because the making of it gave trouble, a deadly offence in the middle-class feminine eye. "I thought you liked toast," she exclaimed with an injured air, observing that he did not touch it. "Sometimes," said Conradin. In the shed that evening there was an innovation in the worship of the hutch god. Conradin had been wont to chant his praises. Tonight he asked a boon. "Do one thing for me, Sredni Vashtar." The thing was not specified. As Sredni Vashtar was a god, he must be supposed to know, and choking back a sob as he looked at that other empty corner, Conradin went back to the world he so hated. And every night, in the welcome darkness of his bedroom, and every evening in the dusk of the tool-shed, Conradin's bitter litany went up. "Do one thing for me, Sredni Vashtar." Mrs. de Ropp noticed that the visits to the shed did not cease, and one day she made a further journey of inspection. "What are you keeping in that locked hutch?" she asked. "I believe it's guinea pigs. I'll have them all cleared away." Conradin shut his lips tight. but the woman ransacked his bedroom till she found the carefully hidden key, and forthwith marched down to the shed to complete her discovery. It was a cold afternoon, and Conradin had been bidden to keep to the house. From the furthest window of the dining room, the door of the shed could just be seen beyond the corner of the shrubbery, and there Conradin stationed himself. He saw the woman enter, and then he imagined her opening the door of the sacred hutch and peering down with her short-sighted eyes into the thick straw bed where his god lay hidden. Perhaps she would prod at the straw in her clumsy impatience, and Conradin fervently breathed his prayer for the last time. But he knew as he prayed that he did not believe. He knew that the woman would come out presently with that pursed smile he loathed so well on her face, and that in an hour or two the gardener would carry away his wonderful god, a god no longer, but a simple brown ferret in a hutch. And he knew that the woman would triumph, always as she triumphed now, and that he would grow ever more sickly under her pestering and domineering and superior wisdom, till one day nothing would matter much more with him, and the doctor would be proved right. And in the sting and misery of his defeat, he began to chant, loudly and defiantly, the hymn of his threatened idol. Sredni Vashtar went forth. His thoughts were red thoughts, and his teeth were white. His enemies called for peace, but he brought them death. Sredni Vashtar the beautiful. And then, of a sudden, he stopped his chanting and drew closer to the window-pane. The door of the shed still stood ajar as it had been left, and the minutes were slipping by. They were long minutes, but they slipped by nevertheless. He watched the starlings running and flying in little parties across the lawn. He counted them over and over again, with one eye always on that swinging door. A sour-faced maid came in to lay the table for tea, and still Conradin stood and waited and watched. Hope had crept by inches into his heart, and now a look of triumph began to blaze in his eyes that had only known the wistful patience of defeat. Under his breath, and with a furtive exultation, he began once again the paean of victory and devastation. And presently his eyes were rewarded. Out through that doorway came a long, low, yellow and brown beast, with eyes a-blink at the waning daylight, and dark, wet stains around the fur of jaws and throat. Conradin dropped on his knees. The great polecat ferret made its way down to a small brook at the foot of the garden, drank for a moment, then crossed a little plank bridge, and was lost to sight in the bushes. Such was the passing of Sredni Vashtar. "Tea is ready," said the sour-faced maid. "Where is the mistress?" "She went down to the shed some time ago," said Conradin. And while the maid went to summon her mistress to tea, Conradin fished a toasting fork out of the sideboard drawer and proceeded to toast himself a piece of bread. And during the toasting of it and the buttering of it, with much butter, and the slow enjoyment of eating it, Conradin listened to the noises and silences which fell in quick spasms beyond the dining-room door. The loud foolish screaming of the maid, the answering chorus of wondering ejaculations from the kitchen region, the scuttering footsteps and hurried embassies for outside help. And then, after a lull, the scared sobbings and the shuffling tread of those who bore a heavy burden into the house. "Whoever will break it to the poor child? I couldn't for the life of me," exclaimed a shrill voice. And while they debated the matter among themselves, Conradin made himself another piece of toast. The end of Sredni Vashtar.
Uncle Abraham's Romance by Edith Nesbit. "No, my dear," my Uncle Abraham answered me. "No, nothing romantic ever happened to me, unless—but no, that wasn't romantic either." I was. To me, I being 18, romance was the world. My Uncle Abraham was old and lame. I followed the gaze of his faded eyes, and my own rested on a miniature that hung at his elbow chair's right hand. A portrait of a woman whose loveliness even the miniature painter's art had been powerless to disguise. A woman with large, lustrous eyes and perfect oval face. I rose to look at it. I'd looked at it 100 times. Often enough in my baby days I had asked, "Who's that, Uncle?" Always receiving the same answer, "A lady who died long ago, my dear." As I looked again at the picture, I asked, "Was she like this?" "Who?" Your romance." Uncle Abraham looked hard at me. "Yes," he said at last. "Very, very like." I sat down on the floor by him. "Won't you tell me about her?" "There's nothing to tell," he said. "I think it was fancy, mostly, and folly, but it's the realest thing in my long life, my dear." A long pause. I kept silence. "Hurry no man's cattle" is a good motto, especially with old people. "I remember," he said in the dreamy tone always promising so well to the ear that a story delighteth. "I remember when I was a young man. I was very lonely indeed. I never had a sweetheart. I was always lame, my dear, from quite a boy, and the girls used to laugh at me." He sighed, and presently he went on. "And so I got into the way of mooning off by myself in lonely places, and one of my favourite walks was up through our churchyard, which was set high on a hill in the middle of the marsh country. I liked that because I never met anyone there. Oh, it's all over, years ago. I was a silly lad, but I couldn't bear of a summer evening to hear a rustle and a whisper from the other side of the hedge, or maybe a kiss as I went by. Well, I used to go and sit all by myself in the churchyard, which was always sweet with time, and quite light on account of its being so high, long after the marshes were dark. I used to watch the bats flitting about in the red light and wonder why God didn't make everyone's legs straight and strong, and wicked follies like that. But by the time the light was gone, I had always worked it off, so to speak, and could go home quietly and say my prayers without any bitterness. Well, one hot night in August, when I had watched the sunset fade and the crescent moon grow golden, I was just stepping over the low stone wall of the churchyard when I heard a rustle behind me. I turned around, expecting it to be a rabbit or a bird. It was a woman. He looked at the portrait. So did I. "Yes," he said. "That was her face. I was a bit scared and said something, I don't know what, and she laughed and said, did I think she was a ghost? And I answered back, and I stayed talking to her over the churchyard wall till 'twas quite dark, and the glowworms were out in the wet grass all along the way home. Next night I saw her again, and the next night, and the next, always at twilight time. And if I passed any lovers leaning on the stiles in the marshes, it was nothing to me now." Again my uncle paused. "It's very long ago," he said slowly, "and I'm an old man. But I know what youth means, and happiness, though I was always lame, and the girls used to laugh at me. I don't know how long it went on. You don't measure time in dreams. But at last your grandfather said I looked as if I had one foot in the grave, and he would be sending me to stay with our kin at Bath and take the waters. I had to go. I could not tell my father why I would rather had died than go." "What was her name, uncle?" I asked. "She never would tell me her name, and why should she? I had names enough in my heart to call her by. Marriage? My dear, even then I knew marriage was not for me. But I met her night after night, always in our churchyard where the yew trees were and the lichened gravestones. It was there we always met, and always parted. The last time was the night before I went away. She was very sad and dearer than life itself, and she said, 'If you come back before the new moon, I shall meet you here just as usual. But if the new moon shines on this grave and you are not here, you will never see me again. any more. She laid her hand on the yellow lichened tomb against which we had been leaning. It was an old weather-worn stone, and bore on it the inscription, Susanna Kingsnorth, O.B., 1713. "I shall be here," I said. "I mean it," she said, with deep and sudden seriousness. "It is no fancy. You will be here when the new moon shines?" I promised, and after a while we parted. I had been with my kinsfolk at Bath nearly a month. I was to go home on the next day, when, turning over a case in the parlour, I came upon that miniature. I could not speak for a minute, and at last I said, with dry tongue and heart beating to the tune of heaven and hell, "Who is this?" "That," said my aunt. "Oh, she was betrothed to one of our family many years ago, but she died before the wedding. They say she was a bit of a witch. A handsome one, wasn't she?" I looked again at the face, the lips, the eyes of my dear and lovely love, whom I was to meet tomorrow night when the new moon shone on that tomb in our churchyard. "Did you say she was dead?" I asked, and I hardly knew my own voice. "Years and years ago. Her name's on the back, and her date." I took the portrait from its faded red velvet bed and read on the back, Susanna Kingsnorth, O.B., 1713. That was in 1813. My uncle stopped short. "What happened?" I asked breathlessly. "I believe I had a fit," my uncle answered slowly. "At any rate, I was very ill." "And you missed the new moon on the grave?" "I missed the new moon on the grave." "And you never saw her again?" "I never saw her again." "But, uncle, do you really believe? Can the dead? Was she? Did you—" My uncle took out his pipe and filled it. "It's a long time ago," he said. "A many, many years. Ah, old man's tales, my dear, old man's tales. Don't you take any notice of them." He lighted the pipe, puffed silently a moment or two, and then added, "But I know what youth means, and happiness, though I was lame and the girls used to laugh at me." End of Uncle Abraham's Romance. Recording by Linda Jenner.
The Isle of Pines by Ambrose Bierce. For many years there lived near the town of Gallipolis, Ohio, an old man named Herman de Luz. Very little was known of his history, for he would neither speak of it himself nor suffer others. It was a common belief among his neighbors that he had been a pirate, if upon any better evidence than his collection of boarding pikes, cutlasses, and ancient flintlock pistols, no one knew. He lived entirely alone in a small house of 4 rooms, falling rapidly into decay, and never repaired further than was required by the weather. It stood on a slight elevation in the midst of a large stony field, overgrown with brambles, and cultivated in patches, and only in the most primitive way. It was his only visible property, but could hardly have yielded him a living, simple and few as were his wants. He seemed always to have ready money, and paid cash for all his purchases at the village stores round about, seldom buying more than 2 or 3 times at the same place until after the lapse of a considerable time. He got no commendation, however, for this equitable distribution of his patronage. People were disposed to regard it as an ineffectual attempt to conceal his possession of so much money. That he had great hoards of ill-gotten gold buried somewhere about his tumble-down dwelling was not reasonably to be doubted by any honest soul conversant with the facts of local tradition, and gifted with a sense of the fitness of things. On the 9th of November, 1867, the old man died. At least, his dead body was discovered on the 10th, and physicians testified that death had occurred about 24 hours previously. Precisely how, they were unable to say, for the post-mortem examination showed every organ to be absolutely healthy, with no indication of disorder or violence. According to them, death must have taken place about noonday, yet the body was found in bed. The verdict of the coroner's jury was that he came to his death by a visitation of God. The body was buried and the public administrator took charge of the estate. A rigorous search disclosed nothing more than was already known about the dead man, and much patient excavation here and there about the premises by thoughtful and thrifty neighbours went unrewarded. The administrator locked up the house against the time when the property, real and personal, should be sold by law with a view to defraying partly the expense of the sale. The night of November 20th was boisterous. A furious gale stormed across the country, scourging it with desolating drifts of sleet. Great trees were torn from the earth and hurled across the roads. So wild a night had never been known in all that region, but toward morning the storm had blown itself out of breath, and day dawned bright and clear. At about 8 o'clock that morning, the Reverend Henry Galbraith, a well-known and highly esteemed Lutheran minister, arrived on foot at his house, 1.5 miles from the Deluse place. Mr. Galbraith had been for a month in Cincinnati. He had come up the river in a steamboat, and landing at Gallipolis the previous evening, had immediately obtained a horse and buggy and set out for home. The violence of the storm had delayed him overnight, and in the morning the fallen trees had compelled him to abandon his conveyance and continue his journey afoot. "But where did you pass the night?" inquired his wife, after he had briefly related his adventure. "With old Deluse at the Isle of Pines," was the laughing reply. "And a glum enough time I had of it. He made no objection to my remaining, but not a word could I get out of him." Fortunately for the interests of truth, there was present at this conversation Mr. Robert Moseley Maren, a lawyer and litterateur of Columbus, the same who wrote the delightful Mellowcraft Papers. Noting, but apparently not sharing, the astonishment caused by Mr. Galbraith's answer, this ready-witted person checked by a gesture the exclamations that would naturally have followed, and tranquilly inquired, "How came you to go in there?" This is Mr. Maren's version of Mr. Galbraith's reply. "I saw a light moving about the house, and being nearly blinded by the sleet, and half frozen besides, drove in at the gate and put up my horse in the old rail stable where it is now. I then rapped at the door, and getting no invitation, went in without one. The room was dark, but having matches I found a candle and lit it. I tried to enter the adjoining room, but the door was fast, and although I heard the old man's heavy footsteps in there, he made no response to my calls. There was no fire in the hearth, so I made one, and laying down before it with my overcoat under my head, prepared myself for sleep. Pretty soon the door that I had tried silently opened, and the old man came in, carrying a candle. I spoke to him pleasantly, apologizing for my intrusion, but he took no notice of me. He seemed to be searching for something, though his eyes were unmoved in their sockets. I wonder if he ever walks in his sleep. He took a circuit a part of the way round the room, and went out the same way he had come in. Twice before I slept he came back into the room, acting precisely the same way, and departing as at first. In the intervals I heard him tramping all over the house, his footsteps distinctly audible in the pauses of the storm. When I woke in the morning he had already gone out." Mr. Maren attempted some further questioning, but was unable longer to restrain the family's tongues. The story of Deluse's death and burial came out, greatly to the good minister's astonishment. "The explanation of your adventure is very simple," said Mr. Maren. "I don't believe old Deluse walks in his sleep, not in his present one, but you evidently dream in yours." And to this view of the matter Mr. Galbraith was compelled reluctantly to assent. Nevertheless, a late hour of the next night found these two gentlemen, accompanied by a son of the minister, in the road in front of the old Deluse house. There was a light inside. It appeared now at one window and now at another. The three men advanced to the door. Just as they reached it, there came from the interior a confusion of the most appalling sounds, the clash of weapons, steel against steel, sharp explosions as of firearms, shrieks of women, groans, and the curses of men in combat. The investigators stood a moment, irresolute, frightened. Then Mr. Galbraith tried the door. It was fast, but the minister was a man of courage, a man, moreover, of Herculean strength. He retired a pace or two and rushed against the door, striking it with his right shoulder and bursting it from the frame with a loud crash. In a moment the three were inside. Darkness and silence. The only sound was the beating of their hearts. Mr. Maren had provided himself with matches and a candle. With some difficulty, begotten of his excitement, he made a light, and they proceeded to explore the place, passing from room to room. Everything was in orderly arrangement, as it had been left by the sheriff. Nothing had been disturbed. A light coating of dust was everywhere. A back door was partly opened, as if by neglect, and their first thought was that the authors of the awful revelry might have escaped. The door was opened, and the light of the candle shone through upon the ground. The expiring effort of the previous night's storm had been a light fall of snow. There were no footprints. The white surface was unbroken. They closed the door and entered the last room of the four that the house contained, that farthest from the road, in an angle of the building. Here the candle in Mr. Maren's hand was suddenly extinguished as by a draught of air. Almost immediately followed the sound of a heavy fall. When the candle had been hastily relighted, young Mr. Galbraith was seen prostrate on the floor at a little distance from the others. He was dead. In one hand the body grasped a heavy sack of coins, which later examination showed to be all of Spanish mintage. Directly over the body as it lay, a board had been torn off from its fastenings in the wall, and from the cavity so disclosed, it was evident that the bag had been taken. Another inquest was held. Another post-mortem examination failed to reveal a probable cause of death. Another verdict of the visitation of God left all at liberty to form their own conclusions. Mr. Maren contended that the young man died of excitement. End of The Isle of Pines. Recording by Lynn Thompson.
The Pool in the Graveyard by Greville MacDonald. By this corner of the graveyard, the red dawn discovered to Jonas a little pool of clear water, with mosses and parsley ferns all around it, and so clear and cool-looking that he must drink. The larger part of it was still shadowed by the wall. On knees and hands he put his lips to it and drank. The refreshment was wonderful. He rose with the sense that he should find the lost sheep yet and bring her home. He looked down once more into the clear pool. It was wider than he had thought. Indeed, he had been mistaken. It was a great tarn on the mountainside. Then he saw that wonderful things were happening on the face of and all round the water. What appeared to be little glowworms were lying motionless in groups on the mosses in a still shadowed region by the side of the water. From beneath a low arc in the wall, where the water was slowly flowing away in a river, there came, against stream and wave and wind, a fishing boat. Its great red sail was spread, and its pennant shone silvery blue in the sun. It came alongside a pier of mossy stones and cast anchor. From it leapt 12 strong young fishermen, all with bright faces. They took up the little creatures with the glowing lights and carried them aboard, then back again to other groups, until all were gathered in. For they were all sleeping human forms, close wrapped in grave clothes, but with their light still living, as might be seen by anyone who had suffered. When all were safe aboard, the men cast off, and the boat disappeared under the ark. End of The Pool in the Graveyard.
An Unfinished Race by Ambrose Bierce. James Van Wilson was a shoemaker who lived in Leamington, Warwickshire, England. He had a little shop in one of the byways leading off the road to Warwick. In his humble sphere, he was esteemed an honest man, although, like many of his class in English towns, he was somewhat addicted to drink. When in liquor, he would make foolish wagers. On one of his too frequent occasions, he was boasting of his prowess as a pedestrian and athlete, and the outcome was a match against nature. For a stake of 1 sovereign, he undertook to run all the way to Coventry and back, a distance of something more than 40 miles. This was on the 3rd day of September in 1873. He set out at once. The man with whom he had made the bet, whose name is not remembered, accompanied by Barham Wise, a linen draper, and Emerson Burns, a photographer, I think, following him in a light cart or wagon. For several miles, Watson went on very well, at an easy gait, without apparent fatigue, for he had really great powers of endurance, and was not sufficiently intoxicated to enfeeble them. The 3 men in the wagon kept a short distance in the rear, giving him occasional friendly chaff or encouragement as the spirit moved them. Suddenly, in the very middle of the roadway, not a dozen yards from them, and with their eyes full upon him, the man seemed to stumble, pitched headlong forward, uttered a terrible cry, and vanished. He did not fall to the earth, he vanished before touching it. No trace of him was ever discovered. After remaining at and about the spot for some time, with aimless irresolution, the 3 men returned to Leamington, told their astonishing story, and were afterward taken into custody. But they were of good standing, had always been considered truthful, were sober at the time of the occurrence, and nothing ever transpired to discredit their sworn account of their extraordinary adventure, concerning the truth of which, nevertheless, public opinion was divided throughout the United Kingdom. If they had something to conceal, their choice of means is certainly one of the most amazing ever made by sane human beings. End of An Unfinished Race by Ambrose Bierce. Recording by Britannia.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
Thank you for joining us on Rising Together for 8 short ghost stories that will haunt you. Which tale sent shivers down your spine? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious.